Well, it's a joy to welcome Dr. Ted Davis to Seton Hall. Dr. Davis is Professor Emeritus of the History of Science at Messiah University. He completed his undergraduate degree in physics at Drexel and his master's and doctorate at Indiana University in the philosophy and history of science. His lifelong work has been studying the interaction of Christianity and science from the time of the fathers of the church to the present. Many of his scholarly publications deal with aspects of the scientific revolution, from Copernicus to Newton, and especially the life of Robert Boyle, the chemist. His research has been funded by the National Science Foundation and the John Templeton Foundation, and he brings a wealth of experience in research and teaching to this field. So we're very grateful, Dr. Davis, to have you present with us to address the topic of why Christianity is good for science. Thank you.
Thank you, Father Joe, for the very kind invitation to speak to this group today, and thank you all for coming. I know that many of you, the seminarians particularly, need to leave around 4:45. That's been put on my radar screen. So if people get up and leave, it wasn't because the talk was necessarily that bad. I might be finished by then. This is not that long of a talk. I'm really delighted that the Society of Catholic Scientists is helping to sponsor this event today. I am myself not a Catholic, and I'm not a scientist. I'm a historian of science. I have some science background, as Father Joe mentioned. So for both of those reasons, I'm not allowed to be a member of the Society of Catholic Scientists. However, I'm a very good friend of Stephen Barr, the astrophysicist from Delaware, who started that organization courageously just a couple of years ago. I'm a past president of a more broadly Christian group in science called the American Scientific Affiliation. And for those reasons, he invited me very kindly, paid my expenses to attend the first meeting of the Society of Catholic Scientists in Chicago just a few years ago. And I'm a big rooter for the Society of Catholic Scientists. Those of you who may have an interest in that, I encourage you to pursue it, or to look at the American Scientific Affiliation and pursue that. Public witness for the faith in the world of science is very important. Sadly, the public conversation about religion and science today is often dominated by shrill, uninformed voices who demonize and insult their opponents, marginalize alternative views in an effort to polarize, and bend the truth until it breaks. We can do a lot better. As a historian of science with particular expertise in science and religion, I have a different view of this than many other commentators. Although the historical landscape is not entirely absent of conflicts involving religion and science, the general picture is substantially unlike the popular conception of ongoing, inevitable conflict that is promoted by certain preachers of atheism. Quite the opposite. I will argue that Christian faith often complements, with an E, complements, the picture of the world coming from the sciences, helping us to achieve a deeper understanding of both the way the world is and how we should go about understanding it, while providing a powerful motive for investigating nature. The Christian doctrine of creation helps us to understand more of reality than science alone can study, including the very possibility of having science itself as a form of knowledge about nature. The tone of my position is no less important than the content. I am not trying to show that every open-minded, well-informed person must draw the same conclusions. There are no slam dunk answers to jump shot questions, and questions about the existence of God, the intelligibility of nature, or the meaning of life are of just that sort. The enormous success of science in explaining so many features of the natural world is partly a result of limiting its methods and scope to things that can be measured and tested against nature, deliberately leaving all other matters to one side, but not debunking those matters as meaningless. Richard Dawkins vehemently disagrees with the point I just made. When he asked himself rhetorically in a Christmas lecture at the Royal Institution, "What is the meaning of life?" this was his answer: if science has nothing to say, it's certain that no other discipline can say anything at all. The arrogance of such a claim, dismissing in 17 words the significance of all art, music, literature, and everything else that any person has ever thought about that question apart from science, is staggering. However, Dawkins doesn't really speak for the whole scientific community when he says such things. He speaks only for himself and those who happen to agree with him. A different opinion comes from the late Peter Medawar, a Nobel laureate biologist who, like Dawkins, did not believe in God. Here's something he wrote once in his book on the limits of science, which is a splendid little book. The existence of a limit to science is made clear by its inability to answer childlike questions having to do with first and last things. Questions such as, how did everything begin? What are we all here for? What is the point of living? It is not to science, therefore, but to metaphysics, imaginative literature, or religion that we must turn for answers to questions having to do with first and last things. It is to a few of those first and last things that I now turn. I'll start with a famous statement from the greatest scientist of the last century, Albert Einstein. The most incomprehensible thing about the world is that it is comprehensible. He was referring implicitly to two different aspects of nature: its regularity and the fact that our minds can delve deeply into it, producing a coherent picture of reality. Both of those things are prerequisites for the very possibility of doing science. And they happen to match perfectly the biblical notion of creation. What exactly do I mean by creation? An idea that might easily be misunderstood if I don't spell it out. Christopher Kaiser, a Harvard-trained astrophysicist and theologian, puts it like this: the basic idea of creation in Scripture is that the entire universe is subject to a code of law, which was established at the beginning of time. This idea has two major implications for our view of the world. First, nature functions with a high degree of autonomy. And here he emphasizes that that word autonomy really means having its own laws. And second, the natural world is comprehended by God, and therefore comprehensible to human beings created in the divine image. I lack time to expand on Kaiser's claims with specific passages from the Bible and the great theologians. Suffice it to say that the term lex naturae, the Latin term lex naturae, law of nature, appears very early in Christian thought, no later than the 4th century, when Ambrose used it in his Latin paraphrase of the Hexameron, the commentary on Genesis by Basil of Caesarea. If that's my broker, tell him to sell. Christian theologians made the concept commonplace long before scientists picked up the term. Precisely because it has such strong theological overtones, philosopher of science Nancy Cartwright, a prominent atheist, has even recommended that scientists stop using the language and concept of laws of nature altogether. As she has said, without God, there cannot be laws of nature, nor anything else with their crucial characteristics. I think she was right. Now, Cartwright's conclusion flatly contradicts a widely publicized claim by astrophysicist Lawrence Krauss, who uses the term anti-theist to describe himself. According to Krauss, advances in cosmology and particle physics have made it clear that there's a plausible case for understanding how a universe full of stuff, like the universe we live in, could result literally from nothing by natural processes, and therefore we don't need a creator. Frankly, this is all bluster. Krauss's pronouncement goes far beyond science, immersing him in philosophical and theological waters that are much deeper than he realizes. David Albert, an atheistic philosopher of physics at Columbia, deftly exposed Krauss's astonishing naivete in the New York Times, concluding that none of Krauss's ideas amount to anything even remotely in the neighborhood of creation from nothing. Physicist Paul Davies is equally unimpressed by claims of this sort. It is all very well proclaiming that the laws of physics, plus the cosmic initial conditions, explain the universe. But this begs the question of where those laws and conditions came from in the first place. Science may be powerfully successful in explaining the universe. But how do we explain science? Why does science, based on the notion of external laws of physics, work, and work so well? Many natural laws are expressed mathematically. The great astronomer James Jeans once said that as our knowledge advanced, the universe begins to look more like a great thought than a great machine. This feature of the universe also has strong theological overtones, leading countless Jewish and Christian scientists to quote a creation text from the Book of Wisdom. Thou hast ordered all things in measure and number and weight. If I were a betting man, which I'm not, I might bet the house on the statement that this particular biblical scripture is quoted or cited more often by people in natural science than any other text. But there we are. It is not simply the fact that the universe can be understood. Something else is more remarkable is going on, something about how we understand it. Many years ago, Nobel laureate Eugene Wigner wrote a famous paper with a fascinating title that you can easily find today on the internet. It's called The Unreasonable Effectiveness of Mathematics in the Natural Sciences. That's on the final exam, so you better go out and read that. Here's what he said. The enormous usefulness of mathematics in the natural sciences is something bordering on the mysterious, and there's no rational explanation for it. With mathematics, we can probe very deeply down into matter and far out into the universe in ways that are completely unanticipated and yet incredibly accurate. Wigner puts it like this. The mathematical formulation of the physicist's often crude experience leads in an uncanny number of cases to an amazingly accurate description of a large class of phenomena. This shows that the mathematical language has more to commend it than being the only language which we can speak. It shows that it is, in a very real sense, the correct language. Let me digress for a minute. When I was an undergrad at Drexel, I spent 18 months full-time as an intern at the National Radio Astronomy Observatory. That's before they built the VLA out in New Mexico. They were designing it. One of the astronomers I worked for is an atheistic Jewish scientist named Seth Shostak. He was a very young man then. Today, he's the director of the SETI project. He's based in California. He was doing different things then. But the SETI project is very interesting, isn't it? As cosmologist John Barrow has noted, the whole project assumes that mathematics is a universal language. Carl Sagan obviously thought so, judging from his novel Contact, in which extraterrestrial beings make their presence known to us by using the prime number sequence. This could only be possible if mathematics is the same at other times as well as in other places. The seemingly universal presence of mathematics in nature is a profound fact about our encounter with the universe, and it cries out for a deeper explanation. If mathematics is simply a human invention, and if our minds are nothing more than the product of a blind evolutionary process that guarantees only our survival as a species and not the truth of our mathematical propositions, then why do our equations describe nature so well? As Paul Davis has observed, survival, and he means here in an evolutionary sense, survival depends on an appreciation of how the world is, not of any unhidden underlying order. Certainly, it cannot depend on the hidden order within atomic nuclei, or in black holes, or in subatomic particles that are produced on Earth only inside particle accelerator machines. All of this suggests that mathematics has some element of transcendence about it, suggesting in turn the possibility of a transcendent cause of the match between mathematics and nature. Is it perhaps the case, as Jeans, Johannes Kepler, Galileo, and Copernicus believed, is it perhaps the case that God is a mathematician? Well, I'm with physicist John Polkinghorne, who just passed away about a year ago. And he said, there's no a priori reason why beautiful equations should prove to be the clue to understanding nature. Why fundamental physics should be possible. Why our minds should have such ready access to the deep structure of the universe. It is a contingent fact that this is true of us and of our world. But it does not seem sufficient simply to regard it as a happy accident. Surely it is a significant insight into the nature of reality. Whether they are mathematical or not, laws summarize an enormous body of observations, giving them conceptual shape while helping us to predict the results of future observations. They arise out of the interplay of reason and experience that lies at the heart of modern science. Although few scientists today are aware of it, there are actually deep connections between theism and the idea that we ought to learn about nature first and foremost by observing it. Living at a time today when we are confronted with enormously speculative claims about an inconceivable number of undetectable universes, it's worth remembering something that Galileo's spokesman, Salviati, in his dialogue on the chief world systems, says to the Aristotelian Simplicio. He says, our discourses must relate to the sensible world and not to one on paper. In our own day, the great cosmologist George Ellis has said exactly the same thing. He was responding to Caltech astronomer Sean Carroll, who recommended that we should accept the multiverse hypothesis even without being able to test it empirically. As Ellis points out, Carroll is basically saying that the rules for doing good science have changed. This, says Ellis, is moving the goalposts. Instead of belief in a scientific theory increasing when observational evidence arises to support it, he, meaning Carroll, suggests that theoretical discoveries alone bolster belief. But conclusions arising logically from mathematics need not apply to the real world. Experiments have proved many beautiful and simple theories wrong. One vestige of the theology underlying the modern scientific attitude is the presence in most scientific papers of the words facts, F-A-C-T-S, and data, D-A-T-A. They come from Latin words meaning made and given, silently reminding us that the facts pertain to the things God has made and that the data are given to us by the author of nature. To take this idea further, I call on Alexander Koyré, a Jewish scholar of great erudition, whose influence on the history of science in the last century was really profound. Reflecting insightfully on the foundational concepts, the metaphysical concepts underlying Isaac Newton's science, Koyré said this: as we see, empiricism and metaphysics, even a very definite kind of metaphysics, the creationist, are closely linked together. What other means, indeed, but observation and experience can we possibly use for the study of a world freely created by an infinite God? During the scientific revolution, that's a term historians commonly use for the period from roughly Copernicus through Newton, a great debate took place between the empiricists and the rationalists, and there was a crucial theological component. The rationalists, such as René Descartes, Baruch Spinoza, and Gottfried Leibniz, held that reason alone was sufficient to discover the fundamental laws of nature. The empiricists, including Francis Bacon, Robert Boyle, and Isaac Newton, held that science could not be done in an armchair. Observation and experiment were crucial components. This irreducible difference of opinion shines through something that Leibniz told Christian Huygens. Mr. Boyle spends too much time to be truthful, drawing from an infinity of splendid experiments no other conclusions than those which he could have taken for principles of nature, which one can certify to be true from reason alone. Whereas experiments, no matter how numerous, cannot prove them. I remind you that even Immanuel Kant thought that Newton's laws were a priori truths. There couldn't be any other kind of physics. That's the kind of rationalism I'm talking about. Well, what did Christian theology have to do with this early modern debate about how science ought to be done? Well, consider what the ancient physician Galen had written. Galen was a 2nd century Greco-Roman physician. He was personal physician, in fact, to Marcus Aurelius, and he was on the battlefield often with Roman soldiers in Gaul and other places. And he wrote a large number of medical treatises, many of which survive. He was comparing the Greek notion of God and nature to that of the Hebrews. And here's what he said. He said, in our opinion, meaning the Greek opinion, that of Plato and the other Greeks who follow the right method in natural science differs from the position taken by Moses. For Moses, he said, it seems enough to say that God simply willed the arrangement of matter, and it was presently arranged in due order. For he, meaning Moses, believes everything to be possible with God. We Greeks, however, do not hold this. We say that certain things are impossible by nature, and that God does not even attempt such things at all, but that he only chooses the best out of the possibilities of becoming. Almost sounds like a 2nd century Leibniz, doesn't it? In other words, Moses' God is free to do things outside of the box in which Galen and the Greeks put their gods. In exactly the same way, the rationalists of Boyle's day felt that the author of nature would never write surprise endings. Listen to these words from the preface to Isaac Newton's great work on physics. The business of true philosophy, which means science. The word science was rarely used in the modern sense then. Philosophy really meant science. The business of true philosophy is to derive the natures of things from causes truly existent, and to inquire after those laws on which the great Creator actually chose to found this most beautiful frame of the world, not those by which he might have done the same had he so pleased. Anyone presumptuous enough to think that he can learn the laws of nature from pure reason must either suppose that the world exists by necessity, and by the same necessity follows the laws proposed. That sounds like Max Tegmark, doesn't it? Or, if the order of nature was established by the will of God, that himself, a miserable reptile, can tell what was fittest to be done. Robert Boyle, who helped create the modern laboratory and its methods, said exactly the same thing. For if we believe God to be the author of things, it is rational to conceive that he may have made them commensurate rather to his own designs in them than to the notions we men may best be able to frame of them. The author of nature consulted not in the production of things with human capacities, but first made things in such manner as he was pleased to think fit, and afterwards left human understandings to speculate as well as they could. Another example comes from Michael Faraday, one of the most important scientists who has ever lived, and one of the most intensely religious. The late Cornell University historian L. Pierce Williams wrote the standard scientific biography of Faraday. I knew Pierce. He was an unapologetic atheist with a Jewish background, but he noted with admiration how he said, Faraday drew more than strength from his religion. It gave him both a sense of the necessary unity of the universe, derived from the unity and benevolence of its creator, and a profound sense of the fallibility of man. Both are worth stressing. Beg your pardon, something happened there. There you go. Pierce continued, the origins of Faraday's field theory are found in his detailed experimental researches on electricity, but the speculations and imaginings which led him to publish physical heresies owe something to his unquestioning belief in the unity and interconnections of all phenomena. This belief, in turn, derived from his faith in God as both creator and sustainer of the universe. As with each of these examples, for centuries, Christian theology has been closely linked with a humble attitude toward nature, toward human knowledge, and a genuine openness to finding wholly unanticipated, even seemingly irrational things in nature. And this is surely conducive to doing good science. Indeed, we have an identical opinion from none other than Thomas Henry Huxley, famously known as Darwin's bulldog, for his eagerness to defend Darwin's theory of evolution when it was still a brand new idea in the mid-19th century. Huxley was certainly no Christian. He is the person who coined the word agnostic to describe his own religious position. But he understood that science and Christianity have this in common. He put it like this: science seems to me to teach in the highest and strongest manner the great truth which is embodied in the Christian conception of entire surrender to the will of God. Sit down before fact as a little child. Be prepared to give up every preconceived notion. Follow humbly wherever and to whatever abysses nature leads, or you shall learn nothing. The relevance of the Christian understanding of creation for doing science should now be evident, but I will conclude with a complementary observation. Doing science actually enhances the Christian life, making one a better disciple of Jesus Christ. Hear Robert Boyle's palpable excitement in this passage about the telescope. Though heaven be an object that has been perpetually and conspicuously exposed to men's view and curiosity for some thousands of years, yet it still affords new subjects for their wonder. And I scarce doubt, but by the further improvement of telescopes, posterity will have its curiosity gratified by the discovery both of new constellations and of new stars in those constellations that are known to us already. We need not therefore fear that our admiration of God should expire for want of objects fit to keep it up. That boundless ocean contains a variety of excellent objects that is as little to be exhausted as the creatures that live in our sublunary ocean or lie on the shores that limit it can be numbered. Yet, this pales in comparison with the sheer rapture that fills Kepler's works from cover to cover. For it is precisely the universe, which is that book of nature, in which God the Creator has revealed and depicted his essence and what he wills with man in a wordless script. Or as he said on another occasion, he said this, in fact, Kepler as a Lutheran, said this to his Roman Catholic friend Herbert von Hohenhart, the Chancellor of Bavaria, who was also an amateur astronomer. Kepler said, "Since we astronomers are priests of the Most High God with respect to the book of nature, it behooves us that we do not aim at the glory of our own spirit, but above everything else at the glory of God." Christianity encourages scientists to seek the glory of God and the charitable service of our fellow human beings, rather than self-aggrandizement, which is an ever-present danger for top scientists. As Boyle realized, the higher degree of knowledge that the scientist attains seems more likely to puff him up than to make him humble. And he noted how the challenges of laboratory life could teach one humility instead. This reminds me of Francis Bacon's famous advice about the book of God's word and the book of God's works, namely, that we should endeavor an endless progress or proficiency in both. Only let men beware that they apply both to charity, that is to caritas, to charitable love, and not to swelling, not to ego building, to use and not to ostentation. And again, that they do not unwisely mingle or confound these learnings together. I close with Boyle's advice to other scientists in an age when so many allow differences of opinion to degenerate into vulgar name-calling. Railing at a man's person or wrangling about his words is a quarrelsome and injurious way of writing that does very much misbecome both a philosopher and a Christian. Thanks for your attention to those remarks. So, before we have a Q&A, which I'm happy to have with you, I just want to announce that the original version of this talk was prepared as a debate position, and that's why it may seem very one-sided in its conception. The students at Oregon State have what they call the Socratic Club, where they debate questions about religion, science, and theism, and bring in people to do that. And my opponent that evening was a local employee of Intel Corporation who was a secular humanist minister. And the question was, is Christianity good for science? So that's the context. That's on the internet. That event took about 2 hours because they had, after the initial positions, there was all kind of audience interaction and myself interacting with the other speaker. It is. Is Christianity conducive to doing good science? There you go. Yes?
I'm always enthralled by the way for example, there's a new telescope that's just been that seems to be able to reach endless space or endless, I don't even know how to talk about it, but are we reaching a new age of scientific challenge now with the new vision of the universe that we're going to be able to see?
Well, I don't know about challenges, but it's very exciting. The key thing here is that if you can get a telescope above the Earth's atmosphere, you're no longer getting a whole bunch of radiation filtered out, basically, radiation across the spectrum. And so if you put an X-ray telescope up there, as they were doing 30, 40 years ago, if you put an optical telescope up there, or some other kind of telescope up there, you can get clearer pictures of things than from telescopes down here. And they can see further into space more clearly this way. There's other things that the astronomers can do too, about putting telescopes around the world in communication with each other and merging their signals together and things like that. So there's a lot of things that can be done, but we are seeing more deeply into space than before. I'm not an astronomer, though that was my interest, as I indicated earlier. I'm not up to date with astronomy. I'm more up to date with astronomy from the 1970s. When I was working at NRAO, pulsars and quasars had both been discovered within the past 7 or 8 years. So it was a pretty exciting time to be interested in those kinds of things. That's all old news now. Nobody had the idea of dark matter or dark energy, neither of which I know the first thing about. Ask a real cosmologist, and they can give you better answers or better speculations on this. Yes.
So a kind of philosophical and theological question about the way you frame it.
Yeah.
So, the philosophical question, this whole debate about laws of nature is an enormous one, right, in the philosophy of science. And you seem to be taking a very specific position about that. I actually like Cartwright's idea of powers and capacities. But in any event, that's like a big debate in itself. And then theologically, I kind of wonder if
Well, that's a very sophisticated question. I would expect the law professor might ask that. You're correct. Your instincts are correct that I'm arguing for a voluntarist conception of creation. For me, that's the great truth taught in Creatio ex nihilo. That doctrine, as I understand it, maybe I don't. There are people here who know more about this than I do, and I encourage them to speak up. But my understanding of that is that what we're confessing when we say the universe is created ex nihilo is that there's nothing external to God's own being that determines what God does in creation. And that means that there's no even standard of rationality outside of God that God is answerable to. And so that's how I see it. And I think that's the right answer. But lots of people in the Christian community would not agree with me. But I think that's the case, that God's freedom in creation is essential. And I think that's highly conducive to doing an empirical science. That is indeed a central point in my argument. Yes?
Thank you for a wonderful talk. I'm coming from a philosophical background, and very grateful for historians of science in recent years as I've gotten into some of these questions myself. But to my mind, it seems that history has a way of showing us the way our narratives are wrong. It's perfectly on cultural narratives around science and religion. But it leaves open the question of whether religion and science are essentially connected in some important way. Right? It can tell us that they have been in truthful ways. And I wonder what role philosophy might play in sort of, especially a philosophy attentive to the way the human mind comes to understanding, the way it works in art versus science and ethics, in sort of convincing us that when we do good work in these various fields, we're sort of intelligent across categories and not just kind of debunking science as the rating criteria for what counts as sort of knowledge or certain knowledge or something like that. So not just a historical account, but a sort of essential account about the way that science is related to human understanding or more broadly conceived.
Well, I sense that you're saying that philosophy mediates the conversation between theology and science. If that's what you're saying, we're on the same page.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
And sort of how can they do that well today? Is my question.
It's a very good question indeed. There is, of course, a whole school of Catholic thought where I am more of a person who dips their toe into it than somebody who really swims in it. Neo-Thomist thought and ways of understanding nature that still not only survives but is now thriving, my sense is, not just among Catholic scholars, but that's an old way of thinking about nature that really has not apparently lost its relevance. I also hear a little bit in what you were saying. Tell me if I've misheard you. I think you were also getting at realism and anti-realism, or what they used to call realism and instrumentalism, right? This kind of thing. About whether the theories of nature that we formulate are actually true, or whether they're merely our provisional pictures of what nature is like. I'm kind of arguing both, aren't I, in that paper? That there is a reality external to ourselves that does impinge on us and can show us when ideas are actually wrong. In that sense, I'm a realist. But I am aware that a scientific theory is a creation of a human mind, or it's a group of human minds in conversation with each other, and that these things do change historically. We should expect that, right? That our pictures ultimately are provisional. But that is a modern kind of insight, that our pictures are kind of provisional, because, of course, the original understanding of science in the classical Greek sense, science was knowledge, it was not opinion. And we could have knowledge, actual knowledge, that was certain. And that's what science is. Even Galileo, for much of his life, as far as I can tell, believes that science is ultimately that which is true about nature, and we can have confidence in it. He says at one point even that, he says in one place that the language of the book of nature is mathematics. And he says in other place that there are some mathematical propositions that we have knowledge of where our certainty equals the divine. That's how he puts it. And so we can have absolutely certain knowledge of some things in the world. Same kind of certainty that God the Creator has. So that's what Galileo thinks. I think he's still operating out of that older conception of science that only merges into this more modern one after there's more of this conversation, including that piece of theology that who are we as humans to tell God what to do? You know, when Niels Bohr says to Albert Einstein, stop telling God what to do, it's that kind of thing. You know, who are we to tell God how creation had to be done? We weren't there. And God made creation according to his own purposes and his own wishes. And as Boyle says, left us to speculate as best we could about how things actually were done. Yes?
Great presentation, and thank you, Dr. Floyd, for your questions. And we should have even mentioned Bernard Lonergan, our institute here, which is all about science and God. And he did a Jesuit and a mentor to Liddy, and I guess Monsignor Liddy, and to Floyd via Liddy, right? So we have a line of it. You know, they've been doing studying a long time. But getting back to your thing about science and God, remember the old days, before the Reformation, right? The Catholic Church, all the universities, Padua, Heidelberg, Jagiellonian, wherever you go in Europe, right? They were created as Catholic universities. They were religious universities, right? Just like Seton Hall or whatever, St. Peter's, whatever. And remember, you had all the other, you had medicine, law, right, philosophy, but theology was the queen of sciences because anything that those subjects going to answer, they went over to theology. Remember, that's what in the old Catholic intellectual tradition.
That's right.
What do you think about that as theology as the queen of science?
Well, I talked about that actually a little bit earlier in Father Joe's seminarian class. But anyway, that notion, as far as I can tell, a few scholars think it ultimately derives from Aristotle, but I'm not sure that's right. I think it derives from Philo of Alexandria, the great Jewish philosopher, contemporary of Jesus. He doesn't use the word theology, but I think he uses the word wisdom or something like that. But he presents this picture under which what we call science today is subordinate to another category of thinking that's more along the lines of ultimate truth, morality, that sort of thing. And the early church fathers pretty much all buy the notion in this language that science is the handmaiden of theology. Now, what they really mean, that theology is the queen of the sciences. Now, when they're using that language, they really mean the queen of learning. So theology is the queen of all learning. Ultimately, everything is given over to her. But as Galileo points out, that shouldn't mean, in Galileo's opinion and mine, that shouldn't mean that we should expect the theologians to be able to dictate to the astronomers and the engineers and the mathematicians how they do their daily business. Galileo says no one would say that the Bible is a better source of geometry than Euclid, or a better source of astronomy than Ptolemy, or a better source of medicine than Galen. Galileo says this. And so he's basically saying, there are these fields of study where people have real expertise, and they're not in theology, but they grant the authority, the ultimate authority of theology. Now that vision really has never gone away. It's still with us. So how we understand the handmaiden tradition, I think, is very important. As for the medieval universities, most of them, to the best of my knowledge, if someone has more medieval intellectual history here than me, speak up. But as I understand it, most of the universities in Europe did not have a faculty of theology. A few of them did. The most famous was Paris. There were a few others. But most of them, you could study at the graduate level, at the doctoral level. You could study theology, if they had a faculty, or law, canon law, or civil law. Copernicus studied both. Or medicine, okay? You could get a doctorate in those fields. You could not get a doctorate in science, as we would say today. The highest degree you could get in science, in what they called natural philosophy, was the MA degree in the arts. And that qualified you to teach the undergrads. So the undergraduate faculty had the Master of Arts degree, and they had mastered natural philosophy and other branches of the arts, which in that time meant basically Aristotelian natural philosophy. That wouldn't change until really into the 17th and 18th centuries as to what was happening with that. So At the doctoral level, that's what you could do. But the way you earned a doctorate in all three of those areas, in medicine, law, or theology, was to defend before doctors, before learned men, they would have been all men universities in those days, as you know, defending before these learned men a thesis about the interpretation of a text. And so in law, we still do that, right? And in theology, substantially, we still do that. In science, we don't. In medicine, we don't. But the approach in medicine was the same for getting a doctorate as it is in theology or law. So you would take a text, for example, one of the medieval commentaries on Galen, like, say, Mondino, a medieval Italian physician, and you would take Mondino's commentaries on Galen and make an argument about what he meant by this, you see, and defend that against other doctors. The notion of creating new knowledge from nature itself wasn't part of that. That changed during and after the scientific revolution. And the modern doctoral degree, the Doctor of Philosophy, as it's called, originates, I think, in Berlin in the early 19th century. That's the research university model. And that comes to the United States first with Johns Hopkins in the 1870s, which originally had no undergraduate college. Hopkins did not have an undergraduate college at first. And then it goes into the other colleges. Many of the other colleges start adopting that research university model. So sorry for the discourse on higher education.
That's very good, Doctor. And you're right, it was law and medicine was undergraduate. But I think anybody from those theology was more like a discussion. That's why it was doctrine. It was a defense and discussion. You know, what we were saying.
Yeah.
Very good presentation.
Yeah, but the medicine was that way too. To get a doctorate in medicine, that was a graduate subject, right? And law, likewise, was a graduate subject. To get a Doctor of Laws, which we still have.
Right, but you could go, theology, you're right, it wasn't on the undergraduate level. Those
Yeah.
were, you had to go 1 and 2, but theology, you could go from those two undergraduate to theology. You still had to have some sort of undergraduate.
Now there were occasionally, shall we say, differences of opinion about the theologians arguing about something versus the natural philosophers, versus the arts faculty. So the undergrad faculty, for example, at Paris in the 13th century, the undergraduate faculty, famously to historians, was pushing the envelope on certain points. They were teaching Aristotelian philosophy as mediated to them by the person that the Europeans called Averroes, a medieval Islamic philosopher, and they were teaching things such as, apparently teaching things that the world is eternal, that there is no soul that survives death, that simple fornication between an unmarried man and an unmarried woman is not a sin, and propositions of this nature were apparently being taught by undergraduate teachers at Paris. The Bishop of Paris, and it is the bishop's office originally that had chartered the University of Paris. The bishop's office intervenes, and he's even asked to intervene by the Pope. And so what happens is the graduate theology faculty at Paris, which includes people like Bonaventure, and over the years, Hugh of St. Victor, and Aquinas, who is recently dead, people like that, and Magnus before him, that these people come down and issue, a committee gets to work on this. Does it sound familiar? And in 2 weeks, that doesn't sound familiar, the committee issues its findings. It's a rush job. And they issue a condemnation of 219 propositions. These are statements in Latin, okay? That the other thing. That the undergraduate faculty may not teach those propositions on pain of excommunication. And so they come out and say this, and that's in the year 1277. So there's 219 propositions that are specifically condemned to be taught. This is unusual. This doesn't happen in very many places in Europe. There's a smaller set of propositions in Oxford. But by and large, this doesn't happen across the board. I think partly because there's not graduate faculties of theology at most of the universities. So they don't have that professional tension, if you will, between the doctors of theology and the master's level arts teachers. But it is true that what happens is overall in the medieval university is that you get a common understanding occurs under which the theologians can talk about anything they want, okay? That they are the queen of the sciences. They can do natural philosophy, and some of the greatest natural philosophers of the Middle Ages are theologians, people like Nicholas of Cusa, who's perhaps the greatest Christian intellect of the 15th century. So you have people like that doing natural philosophy. But the natural philosophers may not discuss theology. Or if they have to in a situation, they must always determine, that is, come out on the question, in favor of the church on the issue involved. So they may not teach their students that the world was uncreated. Okay, to give an example, again, coming out of Aristotelian philosophy. Sorry, I'm a little hard of hearing up here, and there's a lot of background noise.
Yes. So I have a question. Do you think that the level of understanding of the Bible and studying of the Bible has led to an increase in atheism and science?
Do I think that studying the Bible and understanding the Bible?
No, the lack of it.
Oh, the lack of it.
Yes. Like, for example, with the atheist argument, right, they say that everything happened just like that.
Right.
But when you think about it in scientific term, even the body has different regions whereby everything is put into place. So for some, that means there has to be a design for it. Your heart doesn't jump to your stomach because it's separated by the thoracic region, right? And so do you think that a lack of studying or understanding of God, like in terms of even the Bible, has led to that increase in atheism, especially in science?
Well, in some cases it probably has. In other cases it probably hasn't. And sometimes it can be the opposite in more modern times. Historically, that conversation about design versus chance predates Christianity. You know, you find it among the pre-Socratic Greek philosophers, for example. When Plato writes his very famous dialogue Timaeus, which is the one that the Western Latin Christians knew in the Middle Ages. It's the only one of his they knew. It's the only one of which they had a substantial Latin translation. And so Timaeus is a proclamation that the cosmos is thoughtfully constructed. It has mind as a fundamental principle. He was arguing against pre-Socratic philosophers who thought that the world was a chance thing, that nothing happened with any purpose or rationality behind it, that it was all just, random accident all the way down. That's a position that predates Plato, and his Timaeus is against that position. So it's not a debate that originates within Christian circles. It's a larger philosophical debate. But of course, in Christian history, it's part of the picture, very much part of the picture. And indeed, the Bible comes in as a relevant text for Christian believers. But, in modern times, there are quite a few people, many of you could probably name some, who were people of strong religious faith who then jettisoned all that. And many of those people knew the Bible quite well. I'm not going to name this person here, but one of my friends in history of science, for example, a distinguished historian of biology, was a Catholic divinity student. And he's now an atheist, okay? I mean, that kind of story happens. So I don't think it's as simple as you may have been suggesting it, although that could be a factor there.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Davis, for your talk. And I'm not sure if there's a time limit, so I'll just try to keep this as brief as possible. But it was very interesting with your thesis that Christian faith, rather than being antagonistic to science, often complements it. I think that's great. I'm a high school teacher, and I have sensed among young people in high school, college, young adults, my friends, there are kind of a list of issues where
I hear the same thing. I hear the same things. As you say, it would take a discourse to talk about any one of them. But I'll cut to the chase. Suppose you try with your students this. Suppose you make the claim for them that modern genetics absolutely contradicts the Declaration of Independence. Okay? Suppose, just put that out there, okay? Most scientists in the Western world, at least, believe in democratic principles, small d, right? They do. They believe in free societies and such, and we're seeing that even discussed right now, of course, in the news for good reasons. So when Jefferson says all men are created equal, that is abundantly contradicted by genetics. Absolutely false. Every one of us individually has a different genome, and some people are more gifted than others at X, Y, or Z. That's just a fact. And so, a scientific fact, if you will. So, that can't be what Jefferson meant, right? Or it could mean that Jefferson is talking about a kind of truth that is not scientific, and that many scientists themselves believe, but cannot be derived from science. So I would just go with that and see what your students think about that. And as for the neuroscience one, I would do this. This is what I've done with my own students. If you believe that you yourself as an individual are nothing but brainwaves produced by a physical substratum, then if you have children someday, are your children any different from this laptop? Are they meat computers? If so, does that give me the right? I can do this. I can drop this thing, right, and might break it, and I might be out a few $100s. Have I done anything immoral? Probably not, right? Would I do that with my child and drop them over a cliff? And so if that is really, if the one action is immoral and the other is not, why is that the case, okay? So I would have conversations of that sort at the philosophical, ethical level rather than at this claim that, you can't, that there couldn't have been two original parents. Now that's a very interesting claim. I would recommend to you that you take a look at a recent publication by an evolutionary biologist at Washington University, St. Louis. I'll give you the man's name. Yeah, you know him. Joshua Swamidass, right. Indian American, Joshua Swamidass. I know him pretty well. What's Joshua's book called? I'm not thinking of it right now. The Genealogical Adam and Eve. Okay, so if you're interested in this work, go find that and read that. I don't necessarily endorse all of his conclusions, but he does point out, he's got the authority to point out what I have no expertise to point out, that common ancestry in a biological sense ain't the same thing at all as genealogical ancestry in a family sense. That genetic ancestry and genealogical ancestry are very different concepts. And that in fact, Adam and Eve, on the presumption that they existed several thousand years ago, they're genetic ghosts. We don't know what they look like. We don't have any genomes from them. And even if we did, there's been so much mixing of genes since then that you can't just genetically figure this out. So that's a simple version of what he's arguing. But I would recommend you look at that book, and apparently you already have. There's a short version of that in an article form at the website of the American Scientific Affiliation. That's one of the organizations I mentioned at the start. Their website is asa3.org, asa3.org. And so they have their journal, and you can search their journal all but the past few months. And his article was published 3 or 4 years ago. So you should easily be able to find that and download that if you want. There's some technical biology in it that I do not understand. But the basic picture is pretty clear. You're welcome.
No, about that gentleman you mentioned, an American Indian?
Indian American scientist, yeah.
From Washington University.
Right.
Louis? Where was that?
He's at Wash U in St. Louis.
Yeah, okay.
Right.
Now, did he say that we come from two parents? Is that, I remember I read somewhere.
He is saying that population genetics and other disciplines related to evolutionary biology cannot rule out the possibility of an original pair of humans, even a few thousand years ago, from whom all modern humans are descended.
But wasn't there an article before the pandemic, maybe 2 or 3 years ago, or 4 years ago, that said that some gentleman did the work, the scientific work, and said that we came from 2 parents based on genetic science that we've been studying for 50 years now?
Yeah, I don't know enough about that one to have a comment on it.
Yeah, but do you remember that?
Something along those lines. I don't remember it clearly. Yeah, I don't remember it clearly. Yes.
So a lot of the history that you brought up was really science working, if you will, hand in hand, as you pointed out, with theology, trying to understand the mind of God, if you will.
Yeah.
I mean, you quoted Newton's work and extremely religious folks like Michael Faraday. But would you say that science has sort of moved on beyond that? I mean, is the current trend? So I know you're not a futurist, a historian, but is the movement of science sort of away from that? From scientists and engineers and such are able to create in the lab things that many Christians or religious people in general would argue are not natural things. I mean, I think to the 1940s up the road when at Bell Labs when they took germanium or eventually silicon, so sand, and they produced semiconductor material, and now you have a transistor brain effectively in your computer that is allowing you to enhance your ability to give a presentation and think in many ways and write and think forward. And now, of course, in chemistry, you can make chemicals that nature would have never developed by itself. Or in biology, like with CRISPR, you can gene edit and you can make enhancements or corrections, if you will, in the human genome itself, or any animal for that matter. So would you say that we are moving into a different era there, where it's not about understanding just the mind of God, but in a sense being God's?
Well, I know nothing really about technology, history of technology and stuff. I listen to a few people who do, but the one area where I'll comment on is this notion of making us co-creators, okay? Theologically, there are many probably people in this room who know something about that. This notion that we are co-creators with God, that's an old notion. It doesn't originate, with this new technology. You can find examples of this going a long way back. I mean, for example, in the Renaissance, Giovanni Pico della Mirandola, in his Oration on the Dignity of Man, he emphasizes our creative capacities as humans made in the image of God. That's kind of the same thing, isn't it? We're co-creators. We too can create as God creates. Even if we can't create ex nihilo, we can create. We have brains. We have designs in our minds. God gave us this as part of the image of God. So that's an old, very orthodox notion, I would suggest, that we're...
But the ability to change nature itself, I mean, obviously in the news all the time about climate change and all of these things. So in essence, having the power of what you would argue the biblical God is now within the grasp. Some people would argue. Has that maybe led to atheism, where it's like, I don't need God because I have humanity in general, or in some cases individual groups of humans, or individual humans have biblical powers,
Well, we do have the power to destroy.
Right.
Yeah, as well as the power to create. So, maybe. I don't know to what extent this might be driven by an atheist philosophy. It could be, I suppose, for some folks. I know I've talked to a few people in high-tech industries who are atheists and resent the notion that religious people should be able to put ethical boundaries on what they can do, okay? But I don't know how thoughtful some of those people are. I have met a few atheists, not many, who actually consider themselves moral realists. And they maybe in some Aristotelian sense, and they might think that, maybe there should be strictures on what we do. Maybe you don't need God for that, But the idea that there should be moral limits on this is not necessarily coming from atheism. Yes.
This gentleman, very good, sir. But the cloning of the sheep, remember Dolly the sheep?
Yes.
I mean, that was, people question that, but look what happened. When we did that, it didn't live long, it died quickly, right? So there's some things that even our God doesn't even allow us to do, even though we're co-creating, but maybe he's telling us, slow down, But that's where our free will has to come into play, and our decision to choose God over just pure science, you know what I'm saying? That's an ethical battle within the scientist.
Well,
Many of our foods are complete clones of each other. The banana that you're buying in the supermarket is a clone of one banana, and the meat you've probably eaten are genetically modified cows reproduced over and over for their milk.
But some places Europe doesn't allow that. We've allowed it, right? In the European Union, is that right though? That's why we have more disease, people getting, we don't know yet. But maybe God's telling us something, or we're allowed to do it, right? But genetic modified is a dangerous area.
Well, of course, there are stem cell lines or cell lines that are still used in medical research today that come from Henrietta Lacks, right? The American woman who's become famous in these days, even though she's been dead for a long time, because her story is now being told, and that's so that's. Are there ethical restrictions on that and such? Well, maybe there ought to be. In one of the topics I used to teach was the development and use of the atomic bomb. J. Robert Oppenheimer and the Manhattan Project. There's a terrific documentary about that called The Day After Trinity, and you can find this on YouTube. It's 90 minutes. It was filmed while a lot of those people were still alive, although Robert Oppenheimer was dead, his brother was still living. And most of these people who were involved in that were not believers in God, as far as I know. I mean, Oppenheimer wasn't, for example, but a few of them were, but most of them were not. And they had an internal debate amongst themselves about whether or not the atomic bomb should actually be used once it was made. Remember, the bomb was originally intended to be used against Nazi Germany. People who claim it was made to flatten all those poor little yellow people from Japan. No, it was originally made to be used in Europe against the Nazis, but it was not finished until after VE Day, after Germany had surrendered. And then in that interval of a few months, it was then decided to use it against the Japanese because they couldn't seem to get a surrender in any other way. But the debates among the scientists themselves about whether they should actually use this weapon now that they've got it are very interesting. And so, I say these ethical debates, even though a lot of these scientists didn't believe in God and didn't have biblical moral principles, you can still hear where they're coming from in these conversations. It's really quite interesting.
Turn to God after, working on the Manhattan Project?
Maybe I don't know those stories. What I can tell you, one person I have written about is Arthur Compton, the Nobel laureate for physics. He was Robert Oppenheimer's boss in the Manhattan Project, and Enrico Fermi's boss in that chain of command that they had. Compton was a theist, a very active Presbyterian layman who didn't believe in the resurrection of Jesus and therefore didn't stand up in church and say the Apostles' Creed when the congregation did. But he was a theist, fairly robust theist. And he was known as a man who prays, okay? And his colleagues in science knew this and sometimes made fun of him for this. But he brought his perspective to bear on this in a very tortured way he thinks this through. His mother was a Mennonite. His mother was a pacifist. His father was the dean of Worcester College of Worcester in Ohio, which in those days was a seriously Presbyterian place. His father came out of that tradition, more of a just war tradition, and his mother from a no-war tradition. And he goes back and forth in his own mind when he's trying to decide himself whether or not to recommend to President Truman that the atomic bomb be used. So, I mean, these conversations are out there. You can see them. And a lot of the same things come up, whether a person is a believer in God or not. The notion of total war comes in here because, as Compton puts it, in a modern world, industrial world, the ability of the enemy to make machines to kill your people is dependent on their industrial base. And so you're going to have to bomb civilian targets in order to end the war. He reasons it that way. He's right or not, I don't know, but that's where he talks about that.
Dr. Davis, thank you so much for sharing really a lifetime of study, reflection, prayer on this very important area of the relationship of Christianity and science. I know we've all benefited greatly from it, and we hope we can continue the conversation in the weeks and months ahead. So thank you
you.
very much.